Food safety, sanitation, and hand washing. So, I always start this class by talking about food safety and sanitation for a really obvious reason. One of the things we're going to be doing in this class, a lot of, is cooking, and we're going to be cooking for each other. And if you've ever had any sort of foodborne illness, food sickness, anything like that, you know that it's rather unpleasant. Foodborne illness basically is any kind of illness that happens as a result of eating something that's contaminated. So it's an illness transmitted to humans by food. And the symptoms are generally gastrointestinal in nature. So we're talking about nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramping, diarrhea, those sorts of things. Those are all really very unpleasant. And at its worst, some bugs, some foodborne pathogens, which we'll talk about, can land you in the hospital, can dehydrate you and cause really bad things. We've heard in recent years about certain E. coli strains that have caused multi-system organs failure and death, particularly among people who are elderly or the very young. So definitely something that we want to prevent in this class. An outbreak of foodborne illness, as defined by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is an occurrence of 2 or more cases of a similar illness resulting from the ingestion of a common food. You may have heard of this in the news or even maybe just among people that you know. Say, for example, a group of people go to a wedding and eat the food there, and within about 48 hours, a lot of people who were at the wedding maybe come down with some of these symptoms here, the nausea, the vomiting, the diarrhea. And if you look, many times it can be traced back to a common food, maybe something like potato salad or something like that, or undercooked meat. So it's something that we want to avoid in this class, and we're going to spend the rest of this brief lecture today talking about ways to prevent it and the different types of foodborne illness that exist. There are 3 major types of foodborne hazards, as you can see here on this slide: biological, chemical, and physical. We're going to focus mostly on the biological component just because that's the one that we're most at risk of in this class. And generally, foodborne illness, while it can come from all 3 categories, more frequently you tend to see it coming from biological sources. So those are, as you can see, bacteria, molds, viruses. Those are the main ones that we see. Chemical are toxins that the plant produces or the food itself produces, and it can also be things like pesticides and other industrial chemicals. Sometimes you'll see a food recall happening because a chemical inadvertently got into a particular food supply, or they think that it did. So, let's say don't eat this particular food because it might have, some sort of chemical in it that we don't want people exposed to, cancer-causing chemical or something like that. And then physical are just things that can happen in the processing of food, things like glass, bone, metal, plastic, those sorts of things that obviously aren't supposed to be there, but show up sometimes and can cause physical injury to somebody who might be eating the food product. So let's look a little more closely at biological hazards. We're talking about bacteria, viruses, and molds. Bacteria, as you may know, are one-celled microorganisms, and they're found really everywhere. They're found in air, soil, water, on our foods, pretty much any food that you eat. They're all over your body, they're inside your body, they're really everywhere. Fortunately, the majority of bacteria are out there are harmless, and many of them are actually very helpful to humans. But there are ones that cause disease, and those are referred to as pathogenic. Molds are a type of fungus that grow on foods, and you may have noticed this if you have something in your refrigerator that's been there for a while. You might notice sort of a kind of a fuzzy growth Many times they're kind of white and fuzzy looking. Those are funguses. And like with bacteria, many funguses are just fine, but there are other ones that could make you sick if you eat them. And then viruses. There are different types of viruses that can cause foodborne illness. Viruses are different than bacteria and mold. There's always debate as to whether or not viruses are living organisms or not. The way that they spread illness is they have DNA or RNA strands that they replicate um, and inject into their host, which can cause illness. I'm not going to go way into that because that's beyond the scope of this course. But what you just need to know is that bacteria, mold, and viruses are chief among what we are concerned about for biological food hazards. Okay, so there are three major ways that biological hazards cause the host, whoever's eating them or consuming them, make them sick. The first one is called a food infection. And this is an infection that happens purely because of the bacteria itself. As you see here on the slide, illness from ingestion of food containing living bacteria or other microorganisms. The load of bacteria or other organisms, microorganisms on that food is sufficient that it's going to cause some sort of illness in the person that has eaten them, consumed them. Bacteria can continue to replicate and grow sometimes and cause cause the infection. Food intoxication refers to, it's kind of the same thing as food infection where you're ingesting the microorganism that's going to cause the illness. But in this case, it's not the microorganism itself that's causing the illness. It's a toxin that bacteria, for example, is releasing. So, and I'm going to show you examples of each kind of illness, the infection and the intoxication. So basically, these bacteria are releasing some sort of a poison, a toxin, and that is what's causing the illness itself, not so much the bacteria itself. A toxin-mediated infection is when bacteria produce toxins after entering the intestines. And so what the particular bacteria that, and it generally is bacteria in this case, that survive the digestive tract and get to the intestines, it's there that they're designed to start releasing their toxin and cause illness at that point. This slide shows you how bacteria reproduce exponentially, which means it doesn't take very long for one bacterial cell to become literally billions. You can see at the very bottom, on the bottom left-hand side, you can see a single cell at the start. And within a half an hour, this particular bacteria divides in two. Within 1 hour, it becomes 4, and it continues to increase exponentially until we look out 10 hours later, and that one cell has turned into literally billions of cells. So if, on any given piece of food, you're going to have bacteria. Take, for example, raw meat. It's going to have bacteria on it already. If that bacteria is left in optimal conditions, say out in the kitchen on the countertop at room temperature, that's a great temperature for bacteria to reproduce. They're on a food source, the piece of meat that they're on, and if you leave that sitting out there for 10 hours, or even any prolonged period of time, the bacterial load that's going to be on that piece of meat is going to be astronomical. So the odds that you're going to get sick from eating a piece of meat that's been allowed to have that bacteria grow on it are much higher. So one of the reasons why keeping foods that should be refrigerated in the refrigerator, or making sure that foods are cooked well,
is really important because you can end up consuming a whole lot of bacteria that can end up getting you really, really sick. All right, so I'm going to give you a few examples of the foodborne illness types that we've been talking about. Um, the bacterial food infection, the food intoxication, and the toxin-mediated um, poisoning as well. So let's start with the bacterial food infections. And if you remember, this is the one where the bacteria itself is what's making you sick. Salmonella, you may have heard of salmonella. It is the most common cause of foodborne illness in this country. And susceptible foods, I think most of the time when we're talking about salmonella, people talk about eggs and poultry products like chicken. But you can get salmonella from meat, fish, dairy products. You can also get it on fruits and vegetables if they've been handled improperly. Listeria is, it's the second most common cause of illness, so it's not uncommon. It is much more serious. You can have fatality rates. Goodness, I'm having a hard time with that. Fatality rates as high as 20 to 35%. So that means that, a third of people who end up with listeria may die. One of the things that we know with foodborne illness, as I mentioned earlier, is that the older you are, or the younger you are, so very elderly and very young people, are the ones that are most likely to have the most complications from foodborne illness. The thing about listeria is that it's a bacterium that can grow and survive with or without oxygen. Without oxygen, some bacteria just die, they can't live without that, but there are other types of bacteria that can encapsulate themselves and survive in those kinds of conditions. That makes them more dangerous. It can grow in a wide pH range, so very acidic or very alkaline conditions don't affect it, and in a wide range of temperatures. So anywhere from 39 degrees up to 113 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a pretty wide range. And listeria is where it's come up in the news. It's come up in the news in various types of products, but I always seem to associate this one with soft cheeses. They survive very well in under refrigeration, and actually can continue to grow. And it was a few years ago, there were some Mexican soft cheeses that was a source of an outbreak of listeria. So that kind of illustrates one of the foods that that listeria can be found in. So bacterial food intoxications, again, this is an illness that's not related to the bacteria itself, but rather some sort of a toxin or poison that the bacteria is producing. Two examples of this. First one is Staph aureus, and this is an extremely common bacteria. Generally, it's found very commonly on humans. Up to about half of all humans carry this and don't have any side effects from it. They don't suffer any illness or anything. You can see that it can be a common cause of skin infections and acne and those sorts of things. But it's an example of something that is a very harmless bacteria unless there is a prime situation where it's gotten onto food and it's been allowed to grow. So that graph slide that I had a little bit ago, we talked about the heavy bacterial load on certain foods if they're allowed to sit out for long periods of time without proper control. So proper control being maybe refrigeration or cooking. Those two things are going to kill the bacteria. If you get a load big enough, a bacterial load big enough on a piece of food that you consume, and it has enough of even a relatively harmless bacteria such as Staph aureus, it can make you sick. Botulism, Clostridium botulinum. So this is a very dangerous bacteria. It causes a disease called botulism. It's also the toxin that is used in Botox. So, you get an injection of Botox in it's like your face to get rid of wrinkles and those sorts of things. I think they use it for all kinds of stuff. But basically, what it does is it freezes muscles. And that's fine, I guess, if you want to get it in your face to get rid of your wrinkles. But botulism, the Clostridium botulinum, if it's ingested, it also freezes muscles. And the one that's most dangerous is it freezes the diaphragm muscles, which you need for breathing. And that's how people die when they have the disease called botulism from this bacteria. Botulinum is a bacteria that's one of those ones that thrives really well in zero oxygen conditions. It can survive very well in that. And so typically where it's been found most commonly is in improperly canned goods. So home canning, if that's not done correctly, and there is some botulinum in there, it can grow and it can make people very sick and even kill. So the most common cause is the improperly home canned foods, but it has been known to be found in commercially canned foods, although that's extremely rare. So, I think the common practice is if you have a can of something and it's bulging or leaking or something like that, it's generally best to throw it away because of something like this. Finally, we're going to talk about bacterial toxin-mediated infections. The best example of this that I'm sure all of you have heard of is E. coli, Escherichia coli. Naturally found in the intestinal tract of humans, cows, any kind of animal. And E. coli results is generally there's a fecal contamination of the food that causes the problem. So most commonly, you can get E. coli from just about any kind of food that's been mishandled. Generally, we hear about it most from from meats in particular that have been undercooked, like beef. Beef is the one that we tend to hear most often because it's been undercooked. So if you have, some raw ground beef, and you go to make hamburgers with it, and you don't cook it to the temperature that is going to kill the E. coli, which incidentally is about 155 degrees. If you're not cooking your hamburgers to that temperature, you do risk being infected by something like E. coli. E. coli, like many other bacteria, has multiple strains. There are different types of E. coli. And the one that I have listed here on the bottom, the E. coli 0157H7 strain, is particularly dangerous. This is the one that that can kill people. It can cause multi-systems organ failure, kidney failure, those sorts of things. And generally when people are dying from E. coli, that is the strain that's most often responsible. So the next time you cook hamburger, if you don't already have a food thermometer, probably not a bad idea to get one. We are going to be using food thermometers in our class just to make sure that everything is the right temperature. When you're cooking ground beef, 155 degrees is what you're looking for. I have a slide here that you can take a look at of 3 different viruses that are commonly implicated in foodborne illness. So remember, viruses are different than bacteria. They work a little bit differently. The first one is hepatitis A. You can take a look at the onset, symptoms, typical foods that you're going to find those in, mode of contamination, and prevention of the disease. If you look at mode of contamination for all 3 of these, hepatitis A, Norwalk viruses, and rotaviruses, Across the board, it's human fecal contamination. So this is these viruses are generally spread through improperly washed hands. So if you've ever worked in food service, they make a big deal out of making sure that you have washed your hands after you've come from the bathroom, and this is a big part of that. They can be related also to improperly cooking certain foods like shellfish. Shellfish live in our water supply, obviously, which can be contaminated with sewage, and so that's a source of that. So making sure, like the hamburger that we just talked about, making sure that shellfish is cooked well, because again, heat can destroy those viruses as well as the bacteria. So anyways, you can take a look at these. The symptoms are pretty similar to what we've seen with bacterial contamination as well. So to prevent bacterial contamination, even viral contamination, hand washing is going to be really, really important. We're going to emphasize that a lot in class, and I'll talk more about that when we do the lab orientation, what the procedure is for washing your hands. But personal cleanliness, I'm going to be a stickler about in here. I want to make sure that you're not coming into class excessively soiled, I guess maybe is the best way to put that. So we're going to have you wear aprons or lab coats. We're going to have you wash your hands. We're going to have you restrain your hair and do those sorts of things to prevent spreading, just potentially spreading any sorts of bacteria to your classmates, or that's something that we definitely want to try to avoid. We're also going to be doing some control of other risk factors, time and temperature abuse. When I put ingredients out that are sensitive to temperature, like milk or eggs or something like that, I will have them in the refrigerator up until the time that we use them. And then when we're done, I'll be putting it away. And I'm going to be urging you to make sure that you use things like milk and eggs up in your recipes rather than letting them sit around. Let's see. Oh, we're also going to be doing a lot of sanitation of tabletops and those sorts of things to get rid of any sort of bacterial load that might be on surfaces when we come in the classroom, because our classroom is used by multiple people outside this class, and we don't know what they're bringing into the lab. So there's going to be a big focus on sanitation as we go through. The other thing is that if you're feeling ill, if you're sick, if you have any of the GI symptoms, you have diarrhea, you have vomiting, any of those things, I don't want you to come to class because of the risk of spreading whatever you have to others. So that's something that you can just shoot me an email about if you find yourself in that situation. So I'm going to wrap up this lecture by giving you California Food Code. These are the laws that anybody who works in food service is subject to in their work to help reduce risk of foodborne illness, because they're really what I'm going to expect from you all when you're in class. So let's go ahead and read these through. Food employees shall keep their hands and exposed portions of their arms clean. Any part of the hands or arms that will be exposed to direct food contact will be washed with soap and warm water. Vigorously rubbing the surfaces of their lathered hands and arms together for at least 10 to 15 seconds with a water temperature at least 100 degrees. 100 degrees is pretty lukewarm. If you're using water that's, you don't need to be scalding or steaming water to have an effective hand wash. Just use the warmest water that you can handle, and that'll be fine. Thoroughly rinse with clean running water, followed by drying of clean hands. Employees shall pay particular attention to areas underneath fingernails and between the fingers. We'll talk more about that in class. I also cover that in the syllabus. Employees shall wash their hands in all of the following instances. And you can read through these. Essentially, with respect to our classroom situation, you're going to be washing your hands anytime you're touching anything that is potentially contaminated. One of the things that we're going to talk about is how I really don't want cell phones accessible in the classroom. And that's just because cell phones are notoriously covered in bacteria. And I don't really want that bacteria being spread to others in the class. And I'm sure that others don't want to take bacteria either. So that's one way that we help reduce the potential for foodborne illness in the classroom. If you have to touch your phone for some reason, you need to wash your hands thoroughly before you resume activities in the classroom. Obviously, after using the bathroom, you're going to want to make sure you wash really well. And after smoking or eating or anything like that, you just want to make sure that you're clean when you're starting the cooking process, and keep an eye on where your hands are. Anything that's potentially contaminated, it really means that you just need to wash up again, just for everybody to be safe. So my lab expectations is that you show up for class and you're clean. You're wearing clean clothing, you have clean hair, your hair is restrained, your hands and your nails are clean. If you have long fingernails or you wear nail polish, that's okay, but I'm going to have you wear gloves just to make sure that that is contained and we're not spreading any bacteria from that. Closed-toed shoes, that's more of a safety thing. Keeping jewelry to a minimum, we'll talk more about that in class. And then just making sure that you're covering up your street clothes as much as possible, just because being out in the atmosphere, we all pick up different types of bacteria. So I'm going to ask you to have a chef coat, an apron, a lab coat, something to cover up your street clothes, again, to reduce the bacterial load in the classroom.